I'm John Stilgoe. I'm delighted to be here. The Extension School means an enormous amount to me. I'm afraid I live about 30 miles south of here. I want to talk about being a visual historian, a sort of geographic one. And I'm afraid I have to be very specific. And also, there are no slides passing behind me, as there ordinarily are in my lectures. I want to start by saying that several years ago, I got my only bargain ever in an antique store. I bought an incomplete steamship anchor lamp and used it as a post lantern at my house. And after a couple of years, I decided the glass was turning magenta in tint. And I found out it really was. That glass made for certain purposes in the United States before 1917 is tinted with is polluted with magnesium, and in sunlight begins to turn purplish. This lantern is beautiful, but it looks terrible with a compact fluorescent bulb in it, so I've gone back to incandescent, and I've started thinking about the deep philosophical theory here, which is I bought this lantern as a bargain because it was missing its kerosene burner. It had never been used much, and I suspect it was the spared lantern aboard a steamship. It was cannibalized for its burner, and then it was never used, and it never turned magenta because it'd never been outside. So part of what happens, I think, is not just noticing something, not just thinking about it in the past, but also thinking about where in the past it was, which I suspect meant a locker or a box or something. If you think about doing visual history, the first thing you have to think about is being visual, about noticing things. I notice a lot of things, but mostly lately I noticed that I'm the last man on earth with a film camera. But I have to use a film camera because I make many images from a moving vehicle. It's the one thing digital cameras do very badly. This is a serious problem for me because in order to defend my use of film, to accountants in the university who think it might be expensive, it requires old projectors and many other things, I have first told them that despite their $3 a slide digitization fee, I have 150,000 slides. And so I think I'm safe for a while. But secondly, I'd point out that some of us see digital imagery flicker when it's projected. The bigger the room, the more it flickers. This bothers a few of us. Now, we may be the subalterns of environmental history, but I see a lot of flickering lately. I also see more and more people using PowerPoint presentations who have never read Edward Tufte's brilliant little book called The Cognitive Style of PowerPoint. So I think sometimes when I look around as a historian, I'm looking around in the middle of a kind of environmental storm where lots of people have stopped noticing things the way earlier generations didn't notice. If an earlier generation didn't notice the slaves in the field, in some ways that generation's no different than ours, not noticing the flickering of so much digital imagery. Beyond that, however, I find that much of my career has been based on a kind of, I think, what is now thought of perhaps as a feminine awareness. At Harvard and most other great universities, all of the terms that praise a historian tend to be male. He gets right into the subject. He penetrates the issue and all the rest of it. But as Anne Morrow Lindbergh says in Gift from the Sea, sometimes you have to open yourself to a subject. I think if you're open a little bit to what's around you, you often start noticing things that do have histories. It might not be mainstream history. I mean, when my sons got older, they got bigger, and the little rowboat we had was no longer satisfactory, so I bought a very big rowboat. I bought a ship's lifeboat, and I was restoring it one winter and scraping the paint one night and discovered it had a serial number. And from finding out what that serial number identified, that it was a British Admiralty serial number, that the boat had fought in World War II, and so on, I wound up writing a book called Lifeboat. It's about survival after shipwreck. I wrote the book in part because I just wanted to read a book about lifeboats, which are not written about by yachting historians, marine architects, and so on, because they're considered accessories to steamships. The naval architects who deal with steamships consider the boat a boat and it belongs to somebody else. But I'll tell you, once you get into reading about lifeboats, you read about a lot of other things, such as why all American feminists still think that on an American steamship, when it's sinking, the call goes out, women and children first, not every human being for himself. Right? Now, this raises issues of constitutional, politics. I don't know a lot about the Constitution, but I did start thinking about, how it works on the water. Every ship is an embassy, every lifeboat is an embassy, and all the rest of it. And I read Joseph Story's Commentaries on the Constitution, a serious period work. He had the brilliant idea as a young man of asking some of the people who wrote the Constitution what they had in mind. It's worth reading, all 4 volumes of it, especially it will make you and whoever and me about the only people left in the country who have read it. But I'd point out to you that the people who wrote it actually thought that the post office establishment had as its first mission the connecting of distant lovers, because that's part of the pursuit of the happiness of the republic and one of the reasons we have a government. This kind of thing, therefore, connects with my lectures on mailboxes, the post office, why every letter is sealed and is not subject to surveillance by anybody, and while all of us are taking easily the fact that people might be reading our email for anti-terrorism purposes and so on. This kind of an issue for the historian, I think, often leads to the historian being questioned by children, amateurs, other people who think of a historian as someone who understands not only what history was, quote unquote, but how to do it, especially when something comes up, or in a recent case in my town, is found under a woodshed. One of my closest friends, and I live where I grew up, and I have a very diverse set of friends, many of whom never went to college, but it doesn't mean they're ignorant, called me, said I needed my old clothes, and he was really upset. Could you get down here? And under the woodshed of his old house, which the floor had gotten spongy and he'd crawled under there, he found slave dealer collars. The collar with a serial number on it, a number, and the name of the dealer, and it has 2 chains that go around to a double lock in the back. These collars the chains had been filed through. Robert said to me, he said, this is really bad, and it does make your stomach kind of churn. But then he said 2 other things. He said, we're not supposed to disturb them, are we? Because I suppose somebody's got to excavate under his woodshed. But beyond that, he said, why would they have run south toward Cape Cod? Now, okay. Could you tell me that, John? I can't tell them that. I can't tell most people about most of the questions I'm asked. I believe, however, that a great many Americans would be far more interested in history if historians would just make the mainstream a little wider. For example, I drive the United States of America, part of it somewhere, every year as part of my job here. If you drive across the United States instead of flying over it like the smart people of Cambridge, if you drive the country, you'll pass certain areas that have mostly John Deere tractors, which are green. Another part of the country, maybe 50, 60 miles on, will have red ones. That often indicates the richness of the soil. Farmers on high-quality soil have John Deere farm tractors. The reason for that is they could make their payments in the Depression, and they've stuck with the company. Poor soil farmers often stick with Ford or Massey Ferguson because of what the heritage is. I mean, it's just the past of how the John Deere company treated them. I push this issue with my students because I'm pushed with it myself. All of you tonight could Google the last presidential election, the county-by-county election map, not the state map. Just see how the counties voted, and you'll discover that about 89% of the American space voted for McCain. It's not anything other, I suppose, than something interesting until you realize that map is starting to be used by foreign investors to identify places that believe in free enterprise, hard work, pay your taxes, and so on. None of this is pleasant, but it's often the window or the portal on other things. I, too, like to find manuscripts, only I often buy them. I don't have a lot of money, but I drive an old Suburban that has a lot of space. And on back roads in this country, there is all kinds of stuff for sale. Paper goods, I call it. I bought a map of a railroad survey from a woman in Kentucky. The survey was for potential railroad in Colorado. 4 years later, I was in Colorado. I found where the railroad was going to be, and I had one of the great experiences of my career. I don't hike well. I don't mind the ocean, but mountains are part of an environment that require backpacks and other stuff. But I had 2 McDonald's lunches with me, and I was wandering along what was clearly a way you could build a railroad, but there was no grading, nothing. And I ran into a survey crew from a consulting firm. And I'll tell you something. Whatever you think of the Union Pacific Railroad, it's never collided with Harvard University. And we had the same period map. So all of you should think about something. Many Americans, including beautiful people who live in a beautiful place, often live in a place where somebody projected a railroad. I'm not talking about seeing ruins in the landscape, the rails torn up and the grade left. I'm talking about where a railroad was at one time projected because the ground was the right terrain. I work on this level all the time, and I'll tell you, it is the absolute attic or basement or back room of American history. I've gotten used to being there. I was convinced a week before Christmas that Mr. Brown would win the senatorial election simply because cell phones are just the absolute anathema of correct political polling. If you get rid of your landline, you cut yourself off from the pollsters. The pollsters knew this, but did not know how to respond at the time. I think they still don't. But maps, where people have landlines, where they don't have landlines, and all of this, run backward to the special secret use of maps and other data produced usually by well-meaning people for a decent cause. In the 1930s, for example, crop and farm maps were used by people trying to find summer houses. This kind of misuse of secret material leads to issues in the end, I think, about what the secrets are of doing history today. I think a lot of people who are going to become the historians of the next generation are very, very leery of technology. They're leery of what is missed. Many times I think they're aware of what is not in the picture or is in the picture in such a way that it casts the faintest of shadows. It is very hard in this country to learn about the 2 generations of Americans now who grew up never doing illicit drugs. The 10% of high school children who don't do drugs, don't do alcohol, and seem to have a great time. It is almost impossible to go from there to finding out who saw the 1929 crash coming. If we're all very smart in this room, and those of you who live in Cambridge must be, I guess, who are the people who saw the last meltdown coming and got out beforehand? Because there clearly are a lot of them. They weren't running this university, apparently, but there clearly are a lot of them. The media pay them no attention, and most of us are jealous of them. But you can find little bits and pieces of all of this if you look around, if you listen to the questions you get from people who are amateurs, and most importantly, I think, if you don't take yourself too seriously, if you're just willing to be open to what floats across in front of you. How the coyotes got here, I don't quite understand, but I guess they walked. How they've gotten to Martha's Vineyard is another question altogether, and that's one of my minor issues now. How did they get on the steamer? Thank you.